So several people said, well, where'd you get that crazy title from? And the answer is from one of my students. And we were discussing various things that they and others could do about dealing with our smokestack and tailpipe emissions. Remember, we use the atmosphere as a free sewer to dump our wastes. And if we don't control that, sooner or later, then they build up. And what she said is, yeah, but China's now emitting more than we are, and I can't negotiate with the Chinese. How is anything that I'm going to do going to help? And I was just remembering, was that Uncle Joe or Aunt Jill at the dinner table, you know, listening to one of those famous climate scientists? I don't know if you hear them up here very much. You know, the ones who publish all those papers, you know, Professors Limbaugh and Beck. You know, we used to have Crichton. And there are a lot of people who get their information from those folks. And what I want to talk to you about is really a citizenship question, because climate change is just one of a bunch of very connected problems in which you're not thinking about just one thing. You can't approach this problem by just being a meteorologist or an oceanographer or a chemist or a technologist or a biologist, you know, or a sociologist or a communications person. You have to link all of it, because you'll see that. Well, that's also true in healthcare. That's also true in national security. It's true in education. So the question that I really want us to come to later, using climate as an example, is how are we going to govern ourselves through this increasing complexity when in a democracy our job is to send value signals to our leaders about how we want them to take risks with our planetary life support system or other things if we don't know what it's about. So therefore we're going to talk about how can we, and that includes you guys, become literate enough so that we can actually understand what's going on around us, so the signals that we send really represent our own deep values. So that's where we're going to go, and I promise you it'll be a little more fun than that along the way. But I wanted to tell you where we start. So we'll come out later and we're going to talk about stuff that many of you can do, but I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to want to hear. So you have a homework assignment, which is to think about what is it you could do simply in your lives, what you think might reduce your footprint on the earth in a way that's both acceptable to you and that would help, and that you could discuss with your friends and your neighbors and your family and so forth. So we'll talk about that when we get toward the back end of the talk. But before we talk about why we have to fix a problem, I think you got to know it's a problem first. So that's what we're going to do for most of the talk, is go through that. So I give talks on this topic, as you'd well imagine, to advanced professorial groups and to grad students and postdocs and undergrads. I'll talk in high school. In fact, I even do this in elementary schools, right on down to congressional and parliamentary hearings. Just testing to see if you're awake. All right. It's good. The worst thing that happens to a speaker is your first really good joke doesn't work. Then you say, oh, God, it's going to be a slow evening. No, this will be good. All right. And they always ask me the same question. The media, I put them even lower. No, media, we need media, but differently than they are now. We'll spend a lot of time on that tonight. And the typical question I get, well, is the science of global warming settled? Well, that's a fair question. What are we going to fix a problem that's not broken? So I love to answer that question. But first, I usually like to see where my audience is to know how much work I got to do. So now I'm not talking about every detail. Anybody who tells you we know everything on anything complicated like healthcare and education and climate is not very, very smart. So, or they're not giving you the truth. So what I mean is, do we have the basics? And I'll just, in the case of climate, say, are humans at least part of the story of the observed warming of the last 100 years? So let's call that settled for the moment. So that I'm going to get to that in a minute. And let me back up for a second. So let's try a poll with you guys. And when I was in New Zealand about 8 months ago, I asked the audience, and they're pretty green, not the government anymore, but the people. And I said, okay, how many of you think the science of global warming is settled? Maybe 70% put their hand up. So then when I asked the question in Oklahoma, sorry, it was maybe only 7% put their hand up. That was very different. So you find out that you actually get very different responses depending upon the culture in which people are coming from and where they get their information from. So how about this audience? How many think that the basic science of global warming is settled? Oh God, you guys are easy. All right. How many think it's not settled? How many think it's a dumb question? Right. And I'm going to show you why in a few minutes. Because what we'll see is elements are settled, elements are partially settled, and elements aren't. And what is our job in a complex world is to separate those bits out so that we know how to react. So I'll come to that. But first, how many people heard of the Copenhagen Climate Conference? All right, very, very good. So you're all well informed on that. And that's where the 180 world governments got together and they tried to work out a treaty that would reduce the emissions. You have a question on that?
What do you mean by it's settled? I don't know.
Let me come to that. I'm going to come back to it, okay? What I was basically saying is that we know enough to be able to say that the basic ideas are known, not the details. I promise you I'll come back to it because I have some slides on it in a minute. I wanted to do it. So if you hold that, if I don't, you make me answer it. Okay, so went to Copenhagen, and right before I went, there was this cartoon in one of the newspapers. So here's the world. Everybody's out making money, driving fast, using cheap coal, all that stuff. And this little bicycle down in the corner was the artist's way of saying, that's how much Copenhagen is going to do, nothing. And we'll talk later about whether it was nothing or a little bit or a start that we can build on. And the answer, of course, is all of those, depending upon what we do next. But so there was a bit of cynicism out there on the part of this cartoonist about what happened. So then we went to Copenhagen, and I will tell you that my wife and I, Terry Root, and she's an ecologist who's also involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the UN group that looks at the science of climate change and the policies and so forth. And we decided that we would teach a class on Copenhagen. We thought 10 kids would be interested. 56 students signed up for that. We divided them up into China and India and the US and the small islands and the OPEC states. All the people who we knew were going to rip each other's throats out, you know, at the meeting because they have such different national interests. And then they did an unbelievable job of representing those interests in their role-playing, to the point that even with 3 days of negotiation, they couldn't reach a final agreement. But they were able to make progress, which actually was pretty darn close to what actually happened. So then we said, well, we're going. How many of you want to go? 37 students went with us. So we had this massive entourage. We would meet in the morning with reporters and with delegates from national countries and so forth. So it really was, I was very, very optimistic. Because when you get that many kids, and they were flying on their parents' miles and paying for it, and nobody was allowed to go if they didn't have a place to stay, but the hotels were too expensive. So they were emailing friends who knew friends and staying with people. It was really amazing to see when somebody wants to do something, how enterprising they can be. And I felt good. If these kids, I can't wait for this generation to take over the world, because my generation has screwed it up. So now it's time. All we can try to do is help train you guys how to fix up the mess that we're leaving you. But it's not all a mess. There are some other things, and we'll go over that. So we were over there in Copenhagen, and now we'll jump to it in December. And I was out on a boat with somebody. The first thing I saw after that cartoon is, here is Denmark, the temple of green technology, and what have they got? A coal-burning power plant. But unlike a lot of other places, they flanked it with windmills, and these are out there. And just so you know that it's not just 2 windmills that are a showpiece, but if you turned around, the whole harbor is filled with them. So they really are relatively green. But the point that I want to make is they're not producing all their electricity green. It takes time. It takes decades to do these transitions. And